Hello everyone, it's Monday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. Tensions in Ukraine are ratcheting up more than ever. After China and Russia held bilateral talks last week, Russian drone strikes hit the Kyiv region. Not just that, Putin announced the move of tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus, bringing about Ukraine's call to convene an emergency UNSC meeting. With Russia tightening its embrace with China as it builds bulwarks against the Western allies, how are international politics going to unfold? For an in-depth analysis of the war in Ukraine, we welcome Kim Jae-chun, Professor and Dean of Sogang Graduate School of International Studies. Professor Kim, welcome and thank you for your time.
Thank you.
And we also have John Blaxland, Professor at Australian National University, on the line as well. Professor Blaxland, welcome to the show.
Good to be with you this evening. Thank you.
All right, first question to Professor Kim. Chinese President Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin held talks at the Kremlin last week and signed an agreement cementing their strategic partnership. Now, what cooperative agreements have they decided to undertake, and what significance did the bilateral talks have with regard to war in Ukraine?
Well, basically, two leaders agreed on mostly economic cooperation such as energy cooperation, food cooperation, and also internationalization of yuan, Chinese currency, to sort of replace American dollar in commercial transactions in the Middle East, Africa, and also in Latin America to a certain extent. But the most important takeaway from the summit was that Xi Jinping and Putin imparted this strong message to the international community that they stand together. They stand together regarding this war in Ukraine and stand together against the United States. There is a saying that the enemy of your enemy is your friend. So that, I think, is the nature of the relations between China and Russia right now. Two countries do harbor strategic mistrust to each other, which actually goes way back to the Cold War era. But now they are putting those differences aside, to confront their common enemy, which is the United States. So in a way, their relationship is something of a marriage of convenience. But that marriage, I think, seems to be in good shape as of now.
Right. So the core message from the summit was that China and Russia were standing together when it comes to dealing with international issues. Now, Professor Blaxland, just a day after Chinese President Xi Jinping concluded his trip to Russia for what he called peace talks, Russian drone strike hit a high school in Kyiv region and other regions of Ukraine as well. What is Russia's intention behind such attacks?
Thanks, Kim. Yeah, so the pressure continues. The pace of military attacks is pretty relentless, and it speaks to Xi's the limited effectiveness of the Xi peace plan. It also speaks to the determination by Putin to continue regardless, and really demonstrates that the peace plan has got little opportunity to gain much traction. It looks like it was mostly about optics rather than substance, because Putin's actions don't suggest that Xi's so-called peace plan has had any effect at all on Putin's calculations. And if anything, this demonstrates that Putin continues down a relentless path of material destruction with a view to damaging the fighting resolve of the Ukrainian people. It's a path that so far has not proven effective, but it seems to echo the approach of Russia in the Second World War, where just by continuing at it month after month, wave of shell after wave of shell, relentlessly, you will wear down your enemy and eventually succeed. But of course, the scale isn't the same. Russia doesn't have the same military muscle it did back in 1944 and 45. So the fight is a much more drawn out one. But Russia still has the resources it can draw on to continue for quite a long time. And it is that, I think, that Putin is hoping will have the effect of sapping the Ukrainian resolve and morale.
Right, I see. Now, Professor Kim, Russia President Vladimir Putin even announced the moving of tactical nuclear weapons into Belarus, which Ukraine described as Russia holding its ally as a nuclear hostage. Now, though Washington says it sees no signs yet that Russia has moved weapons, what does any such move by Russia imply?
You know, Russia has been issuing nuclear threats to Ukraine and also to the West since the early stage of the war. So this announcement to deploy tactical nuclear weapons I think, is an extension of the nuclear blackmail. And about a month ago, Russia said that they would withdraw from New START. New START, which is the strategic nuclear arms treaty between the United States and Russia. So all these moves that Russia is making is to escalate the tension and to make their nuclear threats more credible. Sure, the decision to deploy tactical nukes is not illegal because Russia will exercise the control over those tactical nuclear weapons. It's not proliferation of nuclear weapons or technology to Belarus. And Russia compared their decision to the U.S. decision to deploy American tactical nuclear weapons in Europe. But one big difference is that Russia invaded Ukraine. And to win that war, Russia now is threatening nuclear attack against non-nuclear weapons country, which is Ukraine. And in that context, Russia is trying to deploy their tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. In contrast, American nuclear weapons in Europe is to strengthen deterrence, to strengthen what is known as second strike retaliatory capability.
Right. So because of such Putin's nuclear threat, Ukraine called on the United Nations Security Council to immediately hold an emergency meeting after Putin's announcement. And it also urged G7 nations and the European Union to alert the Belarusian authorities about the consequences if Belarus does agree to accept this. Now, are there effective measures the international community can take, Professor Blaxland?
So, yeah, there are. There are limitations, of course, because Belarus has increasingly been ostracizing itself from the West. It's increasingly beholden on Russia. But the sanctions, the UN Security Council resolution, the appeal to the UN General Assembly is very important. The UN Security Council, of course, the vote can be vetoed by China and Russia, and that's almost guaranteed. But I think it's the principle, the normative principle of actually standing up for this and protesting on these very important issues is very consequential. I think also raising this in the General Assembly of the United Nations is important, that while this has limited effects on the ability to prevent Russia from continuing down this path, it does have the effect of shaping the thinking of all the countries involved. And this is very much an information battle we're talking about here. China has been very supportive of Russia diplomatically. And Russia, of course, has been taking very much a front-footed approach to engaging with the global south, as it's called, the Africa, the Latin America, the stands and beyond, looking to lock in support, particularly from the Middle East. It's very, very interesting to see the relationship with Iran deepen between Iran and China. This is something that on the surface, these kind of relationships should be relatively easy to counter. But the information battle that's being undertaken is very much a contested space, and it's not one that we can take for granted. While we have the West, the NATO, and supportive countries like Korea, Japan, Australia, and others very supportive of Ukraine, there is a real battle over the hearts and minds of other countries that have the potential to help Russia militarily, not so much militarily, but economically, by ignoring the sanctions that the West's been trying to impose. So this is a big battle. The UN is a big forum for it. A lot of the debates that happen there filter down into the countries, and this is something that Ukraine understands, but the West needs to buy into it more as well, because the battle is intense and it's going to continue for a long time to come.
Right. So though it could have limited impacts, this discussing such matters in UNSC in general meeting could have significant impact because in terms of economic and psychological, consequences. Now, Professor Kim, amid signs of tensions ratcheting up, some U.S. officials have even warned that China could be considering increasing its military support for Russia. I mean, is there any chance China would do so? And if China does send lethal aid to Russia, what significance would such a decision have in terms of international politics?
So far, as far as I know, China has provided non-lethal military support to Russia. But if China decides to send lethal weapons to Russia, I think there will be consequences and repercussions. I mean, the Western allies will make sure that China will pay. And one way to do that is to impose secondary sanctions on China. You know, the U.S. never really imposed a secondary sanction on China, but the secondary sanction is something the West can do to China to penalize China. Knowing this, I think China is being very careful here. China clarified that they oppose using nuclear weapons in Ukraine. China also emphasized that they haven't provided any serious military assistance to Russia. You know, China wants Russia to prevail in Ukraine, but China doesn't really want to be embroiled in the war militarily. That's why China tries to sort of draw the line here. Although they are throwing their back behind Russians, they don't really want military conflict with the Western allies, particularly at this time. China is still behind the United States, and China wants to keep concentrating on growth and development. That, I think, is the reason why China's agenda is a little bit different from Russia's.
Right, I see. So China doesn't want to be directly involved in the Ukrainian war. Now, Professor Kim, meanwhile, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida made a surprise visit to Kyiv on Tuesday last week for talks with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. What were mainly included in his pledges, and what were the main intentions behind his surprise visit to Ukraine?
Kishida pledged military support, military equipment, but non-lethal, and also pledged a sizable amount of money for humanitarian support. But look, I think it's not the material support, but moral support that Kishida's visit provided to Ukrainians. You know, Kishida paid a visit to this city of Bucha, where Russia killed innocent Ukrainian civilians. You know, Bucha now has become the symbol of Russian atrocity, Russian war crimes. Kishida also paid a visit to this church in Kyiv, where there is this war of remembrance, remembering the victims of the war. Kishida paid tribute to the war victims there. So to me, it's all about the moral support. And also this big message that the free world is really behind Ukraine, this message that democratic countries are behind Ukrainians in this war.
Right, I see. So it was much of a moral support. Now, Professor Blaxland, the Japanese Prime Minister also visited India and prodded his Indian counterpart, Narendra Modi, to speak against Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I mean, why is India walking a tightrope between Moscow and the U.S., and how did Kishida's visit in any way affect India's position?
Yeah, thank you. So, Prime Minister Kishida's visit is significant. Japan is the G7 chair this year. India is G20 chair. They've got a lot of notes to swap. The Australian Prime Minister was in India recently. They are Quad partners, India, Japan, Australia with the United States. But of course, the Quad has its limitations, and they are most manifest over relations with Russia. The problem, of course, is that India is in a bit of a bind, because it has a lot of military equipment that comes from Russia, the former Soviet Union. It's also quite heavily trade dependent on Russia, and it doesn't have very easy to replace sources for the material that it gets from Russia. There's also, I think, a hope in India that by remaining engaged with Russia, they can help maybe stave off a deepening of the ties between Russia and China. China being, of course, the principal protagonist with India, particularly over the line of actual control in the Himalayas. India has become increasingly uncomfortable with the adventurism from China, and it's looking for any angle it can to offset that and mitigate the risks arising from that. And for that, Russia offers something that, even with the closeness of Japan, a deepening of ties with Australia and the United States, India has an understandable nervousness about how to manage that while also managing the issue of nuclear-armed and neighboured Pakistan. So India, this is the thing, most of the other Quad partners kind of are prepared to make some significant concessions in terms of India's position over Russia because of its predicament. Nonetheless, I think the Prime Minister of Japan has very strongly pushed that India ratchet back its engagement with Russia, that it give Russia no benefit from the arrangements, and that it looks to diversify. And this is exactly what Japan offers. It offers some diversification, as does Korea, of course. And this is where I think there's some lateral thinking going on about how India can be weaned off its dependence on Russia, while at the same time mitigating the risks arising from its very difficult border situation with China.
Right, interesting. Now I can see why India could be in a dilemma in terms of joining or directly supporting the Ukrainian war. Now, Professor Min, meanwhile, President Yoon Suk-yeol will be heading to Japan again in May for widely expected attendance at the G7 summit. And is it likely that South Korea would also be urged to actively take part in supporting Ukraine? And how should South Korea, in that case, balance its position?
Well, as a matter of fact, South Korea has been providing good support to Ukrainians. I think South Korea has provided economic assistance, mostly humanitarian assistance, and also non-lethal military assistance. But now South Korea is under the increasing pressure to provide lethal military assistance. And this, I think, is putting South Korea in a very difficult position because sure, we are all for the Ukraine and Ukrainians, as a responsible stakeholder country. We feel we are obliged to uphold rules-based international order. This war Putin made to Ukraine is something that we can't really condone. And that, I think, is the reason why South Korea participated in the U.S.-led sanctions against Russia at the early stage. So we are giving material support as well as moral support, but we don't really want to confront Russia militarily because Russia is an important stakeholder country in Northeast Asia. In matters related to inter-Korean relations, North Korean issues to be more precise. But we'll see. We may start providing some ammo, some ammunition to Ukraine if needs arise in the future.
Right, I see. And now, Professor Kim, one more question to you. Moving on to the battles developing in Ukraine, there are reports that Bakhmut is seeing fierce fighting at the moment. And according to the commander of Ukraine's land forces, the Russians are losing significant forces and are running out of energy, giving Ukraine a great opportunity to launch a counteroffensive. Now, if Ukraine succeeds, what would it mean? Is it going to serve as a major turnover in the overall picture of the war?
I think the situation there in Bakhmut is a little difficult to call. I read these reports. I mean, some reports are saying that Russians are prevailing, actually, and Ukrainians are about to be annihilated, wiped out. Although Ukrainians, the soldiers are maintaining high moral force there. I mean, that's for a fact. But it seems as though Russians are prevailing. But now, reports are saying that Russians are on the defensive. So I don't really know. I don't know the battlefield situation there. All I know is that Ukraine now is preparing for a major counteroffensive. Ukraine will muster all their resources. I mean, they will mobilize HIMARS, these tanks, Leopard 2, what have you, really. And if you can prevail in upcoming battle, I think it's going to be an important turning point. But I think the Russians will come back eventually. So regardless of which side will prevail, I'm afraid that the war will drag on for a long time to come.
Right, so the battle in Bakhmut could be a turning point to both of the sides, but we'll have to wait and see. Now, since we're running out of time, Professor Blaxland, I'd like to ask you the last question. EU defense and foreign ministers backed an initiative all aimed at providing Ukraine with 1 million artillery shells within the next 12 months. Is such support from Western allies sustainable, and how would this affect the war in Ukraine?
Yeah, great question. So there is a real challenge there because Western countries have not been developing and manufacturing weapons on an industrial scale. And even with the last 12 months, it's been a really big lag effect in terms of getting manufacturing rate of production increased. And here is interesting. I think there's some scope for South Korea to play a role in actually enabling the war stocks of countries in Europe and elsewhere to actually supply their war stocks and maybe backfill them with some Korean war stocks. We know that Korea's weapon systems are effectively NATO standard. They're consistent with US standards, NATO standards, similar with Australia. It's one of the reasons why we're so confident about collaborating with South Korea is we've got common standards for weapons and for munitions. And that means that there's some opportunities for some indirect but incredibly important support for these countries to have confidence to forward their supplies by getting backfilled by what we know is a very effective and productive and responsive South Korean defense industry system. So that'll be interesting to see.
Right, I see. Now, I'd like to ask more questions to our experts, but unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. But thank you, Professor Kim and Professor Blaxland, for your insights. We really appreciate it.
Good to be with you. Thanks for having me on the show.
All right, this is all for Within the Frame tonight. We will be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.